So welcome to our little event today, which is organized as part of two research projects. One of them is Connecting the Dots, Climate Clubs and Negative Emissions, financed by Formas, the Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development. And the other project is Pathways to Carbon Neutrality, from Pioneering Coalition to Effective Climate Club, ? Financed by the Swedish Energy Authority. So as you will notice, both of these projects are about climate clubs and other things, and both are financed by Sweden. We are very grateful to Sweden for supporting our research here in poor Norway. And while Norway funds quite a lot of climate research, also in the social sciences, a lot of this research is on very narrow topics related to reducing emissions in Norway, which is obviously a very important thing to do work on. But there is surprisingly little research funding of this type for looking at international climate politics, climate policy, economics, and so on. And this is something I find quite paradoxical, because perhaps the greatest problem with mitigating climate change is not lack of technology or knowledge of solutions, but is finding the international political and diplomatic arrangements to implement what we already know. So we thank Sweden for showing the way and hope that Norway will follow suit one day. It's an auspicious day for such an event, because yesterday an agreement was reached to implement CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism of the European Union. There are still some mechanics left to finally adopt it, but it was quite a big step forward, which received surprisingly little attention compared to how much attention this topic has received before. And some people see CBAM as a kind of a climate club or precursor of a climate club. So it's a good time to be talking about these topics. And of course, also after COP27 in Egypt, it's also a good time for some stock taking of our own. I would especially like to thank, we have quite a lot of people signed up for the event. They are trickling in, I see. I think public transport is a little bit delayed by cold and technical problems and so on. We also have many people in the room here from Sweden, both from the research project and from the advisory board to the research projects. So I thank you very much for coming all the way to Norway. And I'm sorry you will have used up your personal emissions quota for the next 3 years, so you won't be able to go anywhere in the near future. And I'd also like to warmly welcome the many people here today from embassies based in Oslo. And of course, embassies and diplomatic services are very important for international climate cooperation and for reaching agreement. So I thought you play an important role in this, and I hope that you will find some inspiration today. And finally, I would like to warmly welcome our keynote speaker, Robert Faulkner, who is former director of the Grantham Institute, a professor of international relations at LSE, academic director of the Triumph Global Executive MBA, run by LSE, New York University Stern School, and HEC Paris, and a very prominent expert on international environmental affairs. Thank you.
Could I just take some? Indra, thank you so much for this warm welcome. And a warm welcome is indeed what we need in this climate. I come from London. I came yesterday and I was pleased to be able to come because climatic conditions in London were not benign for such a trip because, as some of you may have seen on social media, it snowed in London on Monday. So the airport shut down, schools closed, the public transport didn't work in many parts of London. So it's a real pleasure to come to a country where you get real snow and a proper infrastructure that works while there's a bit of snow falling. A friend of mine went on Twitter and with a measuring tape showed how much it snowed in London, and you could barely see the sort of the snow level on that measuring tape. But clearly, some countries are better prepared than others. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Indra, for that warm welcome. My task this morning is to give you a sense of what happened at COP27 and to speculate a little bit about the future of international climate cooperation. And before you ask, I didn't go to COP27. I'm sure many of you have been. In fact, I've written on international climate politics for a long time now, and I think I'm the last person writing on climate politics who hasn't been to a single COP yet. It's a bit like not having a Facebook account. So I think on both of these accounts, I will be the last man standing on this planet who can claim fame because of that. But I do think you can still write military history without having been in the trenches. And so one should be able to write on climate politics without having been to a COP. However, my colleagues at the Grantham Institute at LSE went out in large numbers. And so what I'm going to talk about is largely based on their personal observations and analysis and on my own thinking. So what I want to do is talk first about what COP27 achieved, and then I'm going to give you 4 big trends that I see emerging from COP, but where COP27 perhaps was just one of the sort of pointers in that direction. I'll come to that. But let me start with what COP27 did or didn't achieve. Now, it's fair to say expectations for the COP were pretty low as we prepared for the Egyptian summit. We had a fairly remarkable COP26 in Glasgow the year before, not least because it had been delayed by a year, not least because it had achieved a great many things that are noteworthy. A lot of new pledges were put on the table in Glasgow. There was an agreement on Article 6 emissions trading that was finalized there. We had a pledge on methane. We had a big coalition coming together to phase out coal or phase down coal, as it was worded at the time, and a private finance pledge led by Mark Carney and Bloomberg were issued. So those were big achievements, big announcements, big efforts to drive mitigation and finance efforts forward. By comparison, the successor COP that followed could only hope to perhaps build on that. We didn't expect any such big announcements, and for that reason one should put this all in context. We should also add, of course, that what happened between Glasgow and now was not helping. The broader geopolitical, geoeconomic context created difficulties beyond the powers of climate diplomats. So the war in Ukraine has clearly shifted the debate in Europe about energy security and climate change. We can debate how far that has done it. The global economic downturn, the rise in inflation has tightened budgets and therefore the willingness of donor countries to make new pledges on that front. And the US-China geopolitical rift has, if anything, deepened. So it's fair to say that COP27 was under a difficult star, and therefore what I'm going to say needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, therefore. Because on the whole, the outcomes were pretty grim. On mitigation, the outcome was extremely disappointing. If anyone heard Alok Sharma, the COP27 chair, at the COP27 meeting speak in his final statement very passionately about what had been achieved and what was missing now, he said, quote, "This is not a moment of unqualified celebration." That's quite a statement for a diplomat, a chair. Unqualified celebration was not appropriate. The 1.5 target, he said, quote, "remains on life support," unquote. So in a sense, what COP27 did was only keep that 1.5 target alive, but on life support, because no significant new mitigation pledges were put on the table. The modalities for new mitigation work were agreed in Sharm el Sheikh, but beyond that, we had a call for countries to renew their pledges and improve them. That's not happened. So on that front, I think we're nowhere clear about how we are going to get to the 2030 intermediate targets. We needed a peaking before 2025. We do need it, but COP27 didn't deliver on that. So that was not clear. There's no follow-through on the coal phase down. If anything, European countries and others are reopening, restarting coal mines. And to much of my own disappointment, the British government has just issued a license to start digging for coal again. So the symbols that came out of Sharm el Sheikh and afterwards, and please note the government waited until after COP27 to make that announcement, they are not pointing in the right direction. We are not getting close to meeting the mitigation targets that would keep us within 1.5 degrees. So on that front, COP27 was a disappointment. We need that 2030 ambition delivered on soon. We need about 6 gigatons of emissions taken out of the emissions from the major emitters soon. And next year, COP28 will be the global stocktake. That's when it matters whether countries step up and renew their pledges. Secondly, on a more positive note, the big news was, of course, the agreement to set up a fund on loss and damage. That is truly a breakthrough agreement, and I think it's well worth reflecting on that for a moment. Loss and damage has been on the agenda in the climate negotiations for over 30 years. It was there from the beginning. Calls for compensation for the countries that are vulnerable, that are suffering from climate change, have been made from the beginning of the UNFCCC negotiations. So it's taken us 3 decades to reach what? An agreement? An agreement to create a fund whose modalities still have to be worked out, the financial commitments for which still have to be made, and the rules on how the money would be distributed are still to be agreed. So the agreement is an agreement to negotiate that fund, but symbolically and politically, major breakthrough, because all the donor countries until COP26 last year had denied the need for such a fund, had argued that that is not a priority and should not be attempted. So it matters that the developing countries were united in calling for it. It helped that civil society was strongly behind that call. And to be fair, it helped that the European Union did play a role as a bridge maker in the negotiations in Sharm el Sheikh to help that compromise come through. So there's a glimmer of hope, at least coming out of Sharm el Sheikh, that this has shifted the debate in the right direction, because we do need a loss and damage kind of arrangement beyond the adaptation finance agreements, because we all know that climate impacts are starting to hurt and are hurting particularly in developing countries. So what we saw in Pakistan, the floods this summer, the droughts, the wildfires that have been going around, I think have, if anything, brought that home to negotiators. It just isn't deniable any longer that loss and damage is happening right now. And I think that will create a new dynamic. In other finance areas, adaptation finance and international private finance, again, I think it was a hold still outcome at COP27. The pledges, the 100 billion plus pledges, have been renewed. They haven't been fully fulfilled yet, but on that front, I think there's more work to be done. So you might say this was a pretty inconsequential COP meeting, one that perhaps is a placeholder in between the big Glasgow meeting and then the global stocktake next year in Dubai. What does it then tell us about the future of international climate politics? Can we read anything out of the coffee dregs that are left at the end of this meeting? Is there any pointer to the future of climate cooperation? I think we can deduce from the events of the last year or so 4 major trends that are emerging that I would highlight as the big factors that are shaping and to some extent reshaping international climate cooperation. The first one is that ongoing and accelerating shift towards the problem of adaptation and dealing with the costs of climate change. That's been in the making, well, for 30 years, but it's been stalled in the most part. And that has now accelerated. I think the creation of that loss and damage fund is that kind of trigger that will shift the debate. And I think that therefore also means that COPs from now on will be ever more focused on loss and damage and adaptation funding. That will produce a shift in the dynamics. I'll come to that in a moment with regard to mitigation. But I think that we should expect a much bigger focus in the negotiations about what the North owes, what the South deserves, rightly or wrongly, and how much of that money is being delivered. That focus is now firmly entrenched, and the negotiations on loss and damage will be center stage next year in Dubai. But what are we talking about here? How much loss and damage is there? How much loss and damage will there be need funding for? I've asked my colleagues at the Grantham Institute to give us a sense of how much we are talking about. And the estimates are, of course, imprecise and are difficult to make sense of. But the current estimates, the best estimates we have for the damage that will be done by climate change around the world in 2030, and of course that's only 8 years away, are in the range between 290 and 580 billion US dollars on an annual basis. So that far exceeds the 100+ billion climate finance that had been promised many years ago, and that still isn't fully delivered yet. By 2050, by the middle of the century, when we should be reaching net zero fairly soon, those costs are estimated to reach between $1 and $1.8 trillion per year. Now you can see just why the loss and damage agenda is so important, because it's going to rise in importance, and developing countries will want to make that the heart of future COP meetings. But it's also clear that we will never find international finance sources to cover those losses and damages. That is just not financially, politically, economically feasible. So the big battle will be exactly about how much of the loss and damage that will incur will be funded internationally. How much of that will be covered by donations from richer countries? Who will contribute to that fund? Is it historic responsibility, or is it willingness or ability to pay? To what extent will emerging markets that by 2030, by 2050 most definitely will be developed economies have to contribute to that? China took a very interesting position at COP27, saying that we're willing to contribute non-financial means to loss and damage, but we reject any historic responsibility. If you look at the accumulated historic responsibility, China is now the second or third, depending on how you calculate that, largest contributor to climate change in terms of historic responsibility. And that is only going to drive them further to the top of the league table. They're now in competition with the United States on that front. So will China contribute? They're unlikely to be able to receive funding, but will they contribute? Will the United States, the historically largest contributor, currently willing to talk about this, make a long-term commitment? Is that long-term commitment credible when in 2024 yet another president may come into power and renege on those commitments? Who will cover the shortfall that the United States leaves when it doesn't make those contributions? So expect future COPs to be centrally focused on that key battle over loss and damage. Now that we have shot the starting gun on this issue, I think that will become the critical focus. Secondly, and this is why I think the shift towards adaptation and loss and damage is so important, on the mitigation front, I fear the COP meetings are delivering less and less in terms of tangible results. What we have had is another agreement to keep negotiating on the modalities of mitigation work and to ask for more pledges. Of course, you will say, isn't that the very nature of the Paris Agreement, that we don't negotiate mitigation any longer? Because the Paris Agreement has shifted us away from a Kyoto-style international allocation of mitigation obligations, towards a kind of a bottom-up collection of pledges that are nationally determined. That's the very point of the Paris Agreement. But this just means that the COP becomes ever less important in terms of driving the mitigation efforts around the world. And so I see, if you take the 2 points together, a shift in the COP away from mitigation focus towards adaptation. And the problem with that is that the sort of the procedural successes that the COP makes, yes, we've prevented another collapse of the mitigation talks. The hopes for 1.5, for 2 degrees are still alive. That's just not good enough anymore, because we're coming up against some pretty hard deadlines. If we want to reach net zero by 2050, we need to be somewhere in 2030. That means we have to be much lower in terms of emissions than where we are today. In order to be much lower in 2030, we need to start peaking now. We need to start coming down. Emissions in 2022 are up again. Most scientists had predicted we might might have reached the peak already. Yet again, the global economy has confounded those predictions. So on that front, the COP isn't delivering that much, and for that reason, I think there will be a growing gap between what climate negotiators are doing at COPs and where activists, civil society, and broader groups on the ground are. And if you look at the urgency with which climate protests are now being pursued, in the UK alone, groups like Just Stop Oil that are blockading motorways in Germany, they've blockaded the Munich airport recently. There's a sense that climate diplomacy doesn't deliver on the key challenge of mitigation anymore. And that creates a politically explosive gap between where multilateralism is moving and where society is moving, or at least parts of society are moving. And that undermining of legitimacy of climate diplomacy, undermining of trust in climate politics, I think is a politically explosive phenomenon that we need to consider for the future. It also leads, of course, to a search for alternative arrangements, and we'll come back to that in the discussion. The ideas around minilateralism, a climate club, are being bandied around left, right, and center. The German government made a big deal under its G7 presidency to advance such an agenda. CBAM is one of the critical tools. And more countries will be looking for those kind of minilateral solutions in order to overcome the barriers that exist in the multilateral process. So that raises important questions about whether the COP of the future will be the sort of integrative process that keeps these efforts together and provides a framework for them, or whether that starts to disintegrate and whether countries shift their focus to other parts. Thirdly, I think COP27 also indicated a shift in the focus of climate politics towards a slightly different focal area, namely that of industrial transition and industrial competition. I'm not sure whether you saw the news reports about how many business observers were at the COP, and you do have to ask yourself whether they felt COP27 was so critical to their own business model that they all needed to be present. Turns out, as the Financial Times and other newspapers reported, they were there for many other reasons, such as striking deals on new oil and gas exploration, developing new partnerships on green and blue hydrogen. The FT, with some sense of irony, reported that the Uganda delegation sent large numbers of people there because they knew they would meet with fossil fuel industry representatives to talk about how they can explore undeveloped oil reserves in Uganda. So the COP has now become a bit of a business fair around the idea of a green transition, but that sort of boundary is very widely cast, and you can find people who want to focus on wind, solar, and other renewable energy sources, and others that think gas is going to stay with us for a very long time, and even oil still has a role to play in that transition. New coalitions were formed, the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, the Asia Clean Energy Coalition. So expect the COP and the international climate process to become ever more focused on negotiating the industrial changes that will need to be achieved in order to make a green transition happen. And that's interesting, because that's exactly where the mitigation pledges will be met, in the sort of the speeding up of that energy and industrial transition. So questions of industrial competition, how governments either incentivize and subsidize or hinder and slow down that industrial change will move center stage. And I would also expect the COP, therefore, to play that role as a kind of a global, if you allow, a marketplace for ideas and for deals to be struck in that phase. But that also means, in terms of thinking about the role of diplomacy and what role the UN can play, we need to think about how the COP and the UN can perhaps help that process. So we need to focus much more on standard setting. We need to think much more about how the UN can help to create reliable processes that allow these industries to, for example, account for their emissions and emission reductions. We need to think about how to integrate voluntary carbon markets, offsetting markets into formal mechanisms of accounting. So there's a lot that the COP can do in that space. But that's where most people's attention is now focused on. I think that is an interesting shift we need to reflect on. And finally, there is a broader geopolitical context to the COPs of the future, which came out in COP27, not least because COP27 happened under such a dark star. And that's that's where I want to focus on the wider context of the US-China relationship and how that impinges on climate politics. We didn't see much of that relationship come through in COP27, but that in itself is an interesting feature because in previous COPs, certainly in the run-up to COP26, but also in the run-up to the Paris COP, the US and China went out of their way to pre-negotiate, in a way, their commitments that they were willing to make at the COP. And in both cases, in 2015 and in 2021, they struck a bilateral agreement that helped pave the way towards the agreements that were then reached in the COP. And this was notably absent this time. Not for lack of trying. John Kerry went out of his way to keep in touch with his Chinese counterparts, and the US under Biden have clearly made an effort to re-engage. But what's missing is that level of engagement from the Chinese side, perhaps also an element of trust on the Chinese side that the US are able to deliver in the long run. And what's interesting here is that the ongoing and deepening geopolitical rift between the two superpowers is starting to have an effect on climate politics. Until recently, the mantra from both sides was, we can isolate climate cooperation from geopolitical rivalry. We can protect that area. It's of course in our common interest. It's in humanity's interest that all great powers work together and display their great power responsibility. That mantra is ever rarer in these kind of circles. You don't hear much about that in the current context because the economic and political decoupling that's happening between the US and China is progressing, and that has huge consequences for the net zero transition. We haven't quite seen it in COP27 yet because both sides are still firmly engaged in the agenda, but underneath that surface there are cracks emerging that we should worry about. If you look at, for example, the success of the solar industry that has really transformed renewable energy around the world and is, according to IEA forecasts, going to be the most popular new energy source to be brought on in the next 5 years. If you look at the latest International Energy Agency forecast, solar energy is the number one. It's the cheapest in many ways, easiest to install renewable energy around the world. That has come about, that revolution has come about not because the Chinese on their own perfected that production process or technology, because of deep collaboration between Western and Chinese companies. It was American companies that innovated in terms of new materials that are making solar energy cheaper. It was German manufacturing firms that perfected the production process of solar panels and the machines that you need for that. And it was Chinese companies that perfected the low-cost mass production of solar panels. If you look at the history of solar energy production and solar panel production, then it speaks to the need for a global cross-country industrial cooperation where the different industrial strengths that different countries have are pooled together and brought to bear in that challenge of producing low-carbon technologies. If the US and China, however, are decoupling, if the US wants to achieve technological supremacy or retain technological supremacy and preventing Chinese efforts in that area, if more and more industrial policy in the US, in Europe, in China is about developing not renewable energy champions full stop, but national renewable energy champions, then we're going to lose dynamism, we're going to lose out in the race to bring on these technologies. And so I think it's worrying that the US and China are unable to come back to a kind of more rational level of economic cooperation that would help prevent those kind of negative spirals from taking on. And I, for that reason, I would argue COP27, because of the lack of apparent cooperation between the US and China, sends a worrying signal for the future. That space that has been created in the past has slowly shrunk over the years. Now, there are some who would argue superpowers in the past have always been able to put aside their geopolitical rivalries in the interest of the environment. The US and the Soviet Union in the Cold War struck some interesting deals on environment, particularly during détente, and they were able to see that this is not part of the Cold War dynamic. But the key difference is, of course, during the Cold War, environmental cooperation was a nice add-on. It was an easy way to show your cooperative willingness while you competed hard on the economic front and on the military front. This time round, the situation has changed fundamentally. As the world economy decarbonizes, the technologies, the ideas and the innovations behind them and the products that will make up the future low-carbon economy, they will be at the heart of that geopolitical competition between China and the United States. And Europe will have to find a voice and a space in that area. And that's going to be, I would argue, one of the key challenges that we face in the COP process too. We need to find ways to use the COP process to take the heat out of that competition and to find spaces where the two sides can come together and cooperate. Okay, I think I need to stop here. So 4 trends: shift towards adaptation, the declining space for mitigation, the growing focus on industrial competition and industrial policy, and US geopolitical rivalry as the big long-term worrying trend. Those are, in my view, the 4 trends that we've seen come out of COP27 and that will carry on shaping the future COP process. I don't think it's all bad news. There's some encouraging signs, but at the same time, I don't think that the sort of the positive sounds that are coming out of assessments that we are nearly peaking with emissions can be taken for granted. There's a lot of work to be done, and the politics involved in that process matter hugely. Thank you very much. Javi.
Thank you so much, Robert, for a fantastic start of opening for today. I know that we have some, perhaps most, of the prominent researchers working on international climate issues in Norway are here in the room today, so I'm sure we're going to have a very good discussion. I expect some of you have some interesting comments or questions, but I hope you can make a mental note of anything you want to say, because the next thing we will do is that we will have a panel discussion with Robert and other speakers, which will be chaired by Kasper Szuletsky, who is a research professor at NUPI, joined NUPI not so long ago still, coming from the University of Oslo, and is part of NUPI's growing research group on climate and energy issues. So the floor is yours, Kasper.
Thank you very much, Indra. May I ask the panelists to come and sit on the stage so that we can already assemble the panel? I have this privileged chair which visibly stands out. I'm sure it's also much more comfortable. We'll see. Thank you very much, Robert, for this wonderful and insightful synthesis of the COP and also the broader picture of climate politics as and the problems that we're now facing. Well, we have here a panel of which is varied in terms of expertise, I'd say. Robert, you mentioned and you admitted that you have not attended the COP. So
I'm increasingly proud of it.
Yes. So I'm really happy to confront your perspective with that from the trenches, as you said. So we have with us Georg Börsting, who is the deputy head negotiator of the Norwegian delegation. And I understand you have been to the COP. Welcome. Thanks for accepting our invitation. I would like to ask you, I mean, do you agree with the synthesis of this last summit that was presented by Robert? And are there perhaps things which are not easily visible from the outside that you would like to highlight, which were important in this particular meeting and which may bear on the future of the UNFCCC process?
Well, thank you, and thanks to Robert for your introduction. I not only was in Sharm, but I can also say, my first COP was actually in '97. So, and I came fresh out of university and met this UN negotiation world. And just to put that in a bit perspective, it is definitely a UN process that has changed quite a lot since then, in good and bad ways. But I certainly think that we have a politically in the negotiations a very different type of dynamics, and also dialogue and conversation than we had back then, when the politics was even harsher as far as certainly the north-south confrontation and divides. Still, of course, it's a process that's moving way too slow compared to what the realities are of what's happening in the with the climate. I could have made myself the same analysis that you did. There's really not much I disagree with as far as the overarching assessment of this COP. Well, certainly when we left Glasgow last year, I'm saying we from a Norwegian perspective, we were happy with some of the outcome. We felt there was a political momentum, certainly. We've almost forgotten today about the type of optimism that was also there when we were in a pandemic situation, and there was all of this build back better, I would say, optimism. But still, we knew that we made a step forward, but there was much more to be done. And certainly, an important part of the Glasgow Pact for us was the agreement that all parties would go home, not only start looking at, of course, further looking at implementation, but also on what could be done in order to further enhance commitments. And because of the gap between what was committed politically and what is needed in order to stay within or come into a track where we can keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I think during the time from Glasgow up until Sharm, there certainly was a lot of diplomatic efforts done in that respect. There was a lot of focus especially on emerging economies, where I think many felt that more could have been committed in Glasgow. And not only diplomatically, but I think you have examples of what has been started from a G7 cooperation, looking at how one could facilitate and help what's called a just energy transition and build partnerships, which could make it easier also for some of these countries to make further progress on shifting a trend that's not good in the long term as far as emissions is concerned, while of course recognizing their need for further developing their economies. I still think that was a positive effort, and is continuing, and I think that it's something that at least might help in the long term as far as enhancing also the cooperation in the UN. As I said, I don't think I would disagree much about our assessment of what happened in Sharm el Sheikh. We didn't have large expectations because we knew a lot of diplomatically. It's not like we go from one COP and then come to the next without having a lot of meetings and diplomacy. So we knew approximately where we were. Still, at least from a Norwegian point of view, we came to Sharm with a clear aim to keep the pressure on ambition level and the 2030 NDCs targets, and wanted also to the Norwegian government wanted also to show that we are also taking this challenge that we had from Glasgow seriously. So the government just a few days ahead of Sharm again enhanced the target for Norway, which is already quite ambitious, and there's a lot of discussions, of course, in Norway about how we're actually going to achieve that target. But also an attempt, along with 20-something countries that also, ahead of Sharm, enhance their targets. But it's small economies, so it doesn't make the big change globally. Then, of course, we are also in the situation that has, and described quite well, has changed dramatically since Glasgow. Also wanted to emphasize the need for industrialized countries to show that we're still committed as far as what pledges we have made of finance and other support to developing countries. And we certainly see that it's a political problem that we haven't been able to reach this 100 billion target that goes back to 2009. It's not going to change again the world, but in this process, that you show that you're delivering on commitments is obviously important for trust and trust building. And we are already in a process where we are negotiating a new financial target, climate finance target, which was agreed that we should do back in Paris. So there will be a new financial target that will be set from 2025, which will replace the 100 billion. That is an extremely difficult discussion, obviously. Not only because we haven't reached the 100 billion yet, but since 2009, of course, the needs, the priorities and the needs of developing countries have also dramatically shifted. Not only what we see is necessary in order to help on a mitigation, but certainly also what we see as is coming of effects of climate change already, and the needs for adaptation support, and of course loss and damage also now coming in very strongly, as you described it, Robert. And I was chairing myself that discussion in Sharm el Sheikh. There is a process ongoing, and that target will be set in 2024. The expectations are enormous among developing countries, I would say, because we're now not only talking about billions, but trillions. So it just adds on to this difficulty in ensuring that what we agreed in 2015 in Paris, which is really a grand bargain, where much of the implementation is not only happening domestically, but internationally. So that support, the financial support and other support to developing countries is a crucial element, in my view, of the Paris Agreement. I guess looking forward on the four points that you made, Robert, I think I'm not sure I would completely agree with your description of the discussion around loss and damage. It has been an issue from the start, already back when we agreed on the Climate Convention. But it's been mostly an issue that has been pushed by small island states, which are obviously those who are that in the first rank will have dramatic consequences of what we see is coming with climate change. But it's been increasingly also an issue for other developing countries. And I don't think it's a question of not recognizing those problems, and also not recognizing that there is a need for support financially and other ways. But already back in 2013, there was an agreement in Warsaw on what's called the Warsaw Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which is set to, the aims are to enhance knowledge about the issue and understanding, which is extremely complex. It is also about strengthening dialogue and coordination among relevant stakeholders, and it's about enhancing action and support, finance, also technology and capacity building. And there has been, and certainly I think there has been a positive process, but of course this question about exactly how you provide financial and other support has been a sticky and thorny issue. And I think it's in particular because of this concern that countries have about the legal and other issues connected to the term compensation. But it's not that there hasn't been efforts to provide support from Norway's side. For instance, we have been funding early warning systems, which is crucial in tackling this. And when we came into Sharm el Sheikh, the understanding that the requirement for a fund was very strong among the 77 countries. It's also not that, well, I'm talking from Norway's side, that we disagreed about the possibilities of, and maybe also necessity to set up a fund, but it was important for us to have a broader discussion about how we can use already existing institutions, channels that are there and not only focused on a fund in itself. And that's also based on the experience that we have with setting up this type of institutions under the Climate Convention. And the Green Climate Fund certainly has had a lot of controversies around it, and there's a lot of disappointments among many developing countries, not the least smaller countries like the low-lying island states, because it's very complex and difficult to get finance and funding out of such a fund. So whether this is the most effective way of providing support, we'll see. We'll have now a discussion in a transitional committee going from here and up to next year in Dubai, where we will discuss not only a fund but also on other funding arrangements. And it's important for us that we have that broader discussion also. Let me just also say that, of course, the global stocktake in Dubai is going to be important for the whole process. Again, it's another possibility to, the way we approach this at least, to enhance the pressure on the need for more ambition. It's clear for everyone, I think, that we're not where we have to be. So that's something that's certainly going to be a priority for us. I think there is maybe a bit more. We also, we see some positive signs also as far as what happens politically now. We have Lula coming in Brazil, which Brazil is not it's an important actor, not only as far as their own emissions, but certainly in the broad landscape of the negotiations. For Norway, we've started already engaging with the incoming administration about how we can start up our cooperation on forest, RED Plus cooperation. And we have in Australia with a government that is, we've never seen an Australian government with such high ambitions for what they want to do, not only from the States, but also in the Pacific region. Also inviting now for a COP in Australia in 2026, which a year ago I would never have thought that would ever happen. And of course, you're describing the U.S.-China relationship. Of course, it's going to be that is crucial. It has been, and it's going to be also in the future. And at least we saw some. We didn't see any. There wasn't like a negative confrontation or anything during these 2 weeks in Sharm el Sheikh. And we try to read the positive signs that we get from meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping after the COP, as at least a sign that maybe there might be a possibility for a dialogue where climate change can be discussed even in the really difficult other issues that are confronting or a relationship between the US and China. But we'll see. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you also for opening for the future. This we'll come back to this and the visions for the next COP. I wanted to introduce our second panelist, Nagme Nasritusi, who is an associate professor at the University of Stockholm and also a partner in the projects that Indra has introduced at the beginning. Nagme, you work a lot on minilateral solutions, so climate clubs and other alternatives to the UNFCCC process. How do you see the progress of global climate governance combining those two perspectives and following the COP that just ended?
Thank you. First, thanks to Robert for that comprehensive overview, which I agree with. So I think you were correct in your analysis that either the UNFCCC can continue to try to provide this integrative framework for not just the multilateral process, but all these other initiatives that have sprung up, public-private partnerships and different coalitions and alliances. Or there is a risk that the UNFCCC process will kind of be marginalized or not be the focus of this mitigation agenda that you mentioned. But it's still something we will have to watch. And what we've written about is this crucial role that the UNFCCC has in legitimacy. Because of the consensus rule, all countries feel included, more or less. So with the minilateral fora, we do have the benefits of sort of quicker decision-making in some forms, but the literature shows that those fora are not necessarily more ambitious, because if you do reduce the numbers and you focus on the most the biggest emitters, basically, that is where the problem lies, and you won't necessarily have better decisions through that process. So we've seen with the EU advancing the green agenda and the CBAM, that will be very interesting to follow to see how will they do the diplomatic work, because there has been a lot of criticism that it distracts from the multilateral process. And then at the same time, we have the G7 proposal of a climate club, which is not really a climate club, but more like a coalition or alliance, but that has this more open kind of initiative that invites other countries to join. So how those two things work in tandem will be very interesting to follow and to see who joins and who challenges this type of initiative. But just to add on to what I saw at the COP27, which I also did not attend, but followed online, I think you did mention the finance issues, but also I think there was a big push for bigger systemic reforms. So the Bridgetown proposal, for example, and the push, I know from the EU in particular, to operationalize Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which is on the financial flows. I think that kind of push to sort of redirect financial flows to help the transition will become more important. And then there was the Indian proposal, which also appeared during COP26, but which was more forcefully developed, was on this, that it shouldn't just be a focus on coal power to be phased down, but all fossil fuels, so oil and gas as well. And more than 80 countries said that they would like to discuss this, but of course, because of consensus rules, it didn't happen. But I think that kind of discussion is very necessary to have. But whether it could happen at the UNFCCC or in other fora, we'll have to wait and see. And the third thing that was interesting was the UN high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state actors. to try to bring in this notion of integrity and accountability for net zero commitments made by non-state actors, which I think is also a very necessary drive.
Thank you, Nagme. We're also very honored to have with us today Fari Bozelli, who is a professor of political science at Lund University and an expert in the architecture of global environmental governance, broadly speaking. Fari, I would like to ask you about, about the broader picture, because we are focusing right now on the climate regime, but climate is not the only environmental issue that we have to fix on the global level. So how does the UNFCCC process interact with other governance processes out there, and are there synergies, or also are there conflicts between those?
Right, can you hear me? Yeah, that's actually switched on. Wonderful. And thanks for the question. I think that, and thanks for having me here. I think that Nagme already touched quite a bit upon this question of alternative arenas, both within the realm of climate change and regarding other issue areas. I would like to, not ignoring your question, but I would like to add on maybe a bit to the analysis of the COP, which I've also haven't attended, but you know, just to add, I'm concurring with what has been said, obviously, regarding that loss and damage was the big success, and that we're lacking behind on other issues. I mean, one impression that came very clearly across from the observers is that the COP was hopelessly overblown, that there was a too high level of ambition by the organizers, wanting to make it the implementation COP, make it the loss and damage COP, make it the Africa COP, and they failed on most of these grounds because they wanted too much at the same time, apart from organizational issues, which we also you know, learned from the past. Think of Copenhagen 2009, they can play a role. So this is just something I wanted to add, that while I would also very strongly, with regard to legitimacy, for example, claim that we need to keep the UNFCCC process in the center where it belongs, and it will remain in the center, there is always this danger of overblowing it. There is no perfect solution, right? You want to have things under one roof, that's what can happen. And I think much what we saw with regard to mitigation, lack of progress, basically on the global stocktake, also on what has been agreed on in Glasgow with the mitigation work program, to fill out the blanks, basically, that we have, now that we do not have a second Kyoto Protocol, but a Paris Agreement. I think you called it a grand bargain, right? So we need to fill out blanks when it comes to implementation and compliance. That didn't work at all in Sharm el Sheikh. And, you know, I would also hope that the next COP that is dedicated to the stocktake will change that, but we don't know. We kind of put ourselves on a path in Paris already, where the agreement has been, to a certain extent, I would call this re-unilateralized. As we heard, lots in terms of implementation is put back into the hands of countries, and we're now trying to catch up frantically, year by year, on the question of joint implementation and bringing back CDM, and which is now called Article 6.4 ER, and so forth. So there's a lot of catch-up work to be done, and you know, year by year we're struggling. So that's just some further information from what we saw at Sharm el Sheikh. And I would possibly challenge you a bit on the adaptation hope, because while we made this progress on loss and damage, I found it remarkable that we didn't on adaptation. And that was partly because it was overblown, that was because attention levels can only go so far, but it was also because countries kept bickering on metrics and funding. So in a way, it feels like the adaptation debate is, well, it's probably as old as the loss and damage debate, but it's further in many regards, and exactly because it is further, there are all these nitty-gritty debates. So maybe I don't even think maybe, there is a trend that it's easier to agree on a fund first and on goals first, and then filling out the blanks becomes the issue, and I think that's where the adaptation debate is, and loss and damage is lagging behind. That's maybe why we had a success there, and I don't mean that to be cynical. It's just that history seems to repeat itself a bit with negotiations. Addressing your question directly now with regard to other issue areas, I think one potential I just want to look at that has not been perfectly exploited yet is the whole question of how climate negotiations relate to biodiversity relations. We had some efforts years back with an ad hoc technical expert group that has not gone very far. It was an initiative between secretariats that had its limits. And I think that's where we can do a lot better. We now have new types of collaborations, remarkably most of all, also between scientists, between the IPCC on the one hand and IPBES on the other hand, that could bring us in a certain direction. So I think there is a potential, and it's probably something I will come back to when we come to the question on hopes and a certain type of future, but just to mention that we could have a much more integrated talk about responsibility, about north-south issues, about abolishing harmful subsidies that we need to maybe look at in tandem for both issue areas, for example. That hasn't happened at all. On the other hand, something I see currently, which we also should try to avoid, is to draw the wrong lessons from the climate process and feed them into the biodiversity process. We are discussing and basically, in a way, finalizing now the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and in a way, it's again following the logic that we see in the Paris Agreement, putting out overarching goals first and then struggling with the implementation issue. And so there seems to be a bit of a trend now, I would call this a kind of third phase in global environmental governance, where we have this goal fixation, if I may call it that way, and then need to fill out the blanks later. A second phase was probably what we had with Kyoto, and the first phase, what you mentioned, under the Cold War, where in many regards we negotiated the strongest types of agreements as sidekicks to economy and security agreements. That time is long gone. We have now more these kind of orchestrating goal-oriented aspects that put a lot of more, or keep a lot of sovereignty with countries. We have to struggle with that. I'd like to come back to Nagme's point, though, about, or also to your point about the new focus on multilateral forums. I think that can't be underestimated. There is, I think none of us here in the room is totally saying that is the solution, right? But it's something we have, and it's something we have to be vigilant about. There is definitely advantages that have been mentioned. You mentioned CBAM. I'd also like to mention the whole debate about fossil fuel subsidy reform, which has been a non-starter for a long time in the climate regime, but which has gone somewhere with these external arenas. Think of Friends of Fossil Fuel Subsidy Reform. You worked on this, right? Or we worked on this together in a project some time ago. APAC, G20. I mean, that's where they created some sort of momentum, which is laudable. If you even think this whole fragmentation and complexity in a wider way, we have all these climate actions that are registered under NASCA, about 30,000 actions and so forth. So there's a lot happening. And it helps to reinvigorate debates. It helps to keep, sometimes, with all the decoupling you're rightfully observing, keeping the Chinese on the table or at the table. But with all these advantages, I also see disadvantages. And I just, I got inspired by what you said. So I'd just like to stress 2 or 3 of these. And the first one is regarding legitimacy. Adding to what you said is, in political science, and I'm a political scientist, so I have to bring this role in without wanting to be in an ivory tower, but one definition we have of legitimacy is sociological legitimacy. That means that those that are governed accept those who govern them, or the right of those who govern them to do so. And if you have quite a few international institutions, hundreds actually dealing with climate change, some of which you don't even know that they do so, unless you're very well informed, G20, APEC, and so forth are mentioned. People don't even know that, and if they don't know these institutions, how shall they give them legitimacy? So we can't have both. We can't have these different arenas as much as they reinvigorate things and legitimacy as a whole. We're losing on the legitimacy ground, and I think that's something to be aware of. Also, I don't find these arenas very helpful when it comes to implementation, so they're not going to help us fill out the blanks. We have enough research. I mean, there's more to be done, but we have research on some of these arenas and their lack of effectiveness. There's quite a few being done on SDG partnerships that have been hyped in a way that we don't know too much, don't see too much effectiveness with. What they deliver is agenda setting and information sharing, but they mostly do so following a certain market logic. So they go where the interests are. 2/3 and more of the climate action initiatives that are registered under NASCA are from the global north. 3/4 and more are dealing, of course, with questions of mitigation, not with questions of adaptation, and only a fraction deals with the question of, and that's my last point, with the question of tackling production of fossil fuels and not just consumption. Right? The big part is still dealing with the same questions that we are dealing with under the climate regime. So the whole hopes, which will be for the second round, for a non-proliferation treaty and so forth, they are not crystallizing somewhere else. So my last comment here as a political scientist, the reasons that we see that determine partly why we are stuck in climate negotiations are replicated in other fields. So just hoping that other fields are reinvigorating the debate is a bit too naive. They do in some ways, but only to a certain extent.
Thank you very much, Fariborz. Much like financing in the Loss and Damage Fund, time is in short supply in our panels. Since I would like to open to the general Q&A soon, I just wanted to give you, Robert, a chance to briefly respond to the points made by the other panelists, and also, so that we perhaps end on a more optimistic note, name 3, maybe 2 hopes for the next COP, things that you would like to see ideally with the global stocktake or related to some other aspect of the process. And the same question to the other panelists.
Want an optimistic note to finish on, perhaps not to ask that question. But I'll keep it very brief. And I think there's a lot of agreement on this panel, which is always worrying when there's a panel going on. But let me just perhaps point out two clarifications to what was said. First of all, the point about unilateralism and minilateralism and the drive away from the multilateral agenda. To some extent, I would actually argue it's not a big problem in itself, because the net zero transition has to be organized on a scale that would go beyond any multilateral process, right?
Yeah.
We've never organized on a global level an industrial transition of the scale that we need and through one multilateral forum. Climate policy is energy policy, is industrial policy, is technology policy. It's about urban living. It's about agriculture. It's about food production, right? So there's, as we drive the net zero transition forward into all these areas, more and more forums will become engaged and are already becoming engaged, and more institutions will have to deal with that. So in some ways, we should all relax a little bit and accept that this is a natural way to go. Of course, we are focusing here on the COP process, so that's why we're worried about this. So that I would therefore turn this into a question of what can the UNFCCC do to make sense of all this kind of proliferation of forums, so that they don't compete with each other, so that they don't get into the sort of interbureaucratic wranglings over who gets finance and who loses out. This shouldn't be a zero-sum game. I agree with you, Fari, that a lot of these initiatives are they're very hollow, they just replicate the existing initiatives. I was part in some of the consultations for the German G7 initiative, and it became apparent that this was an idea in search of content and form. And so, as so often, political leaders need to come up with new solutions when they're stuck somewhere, and the multilateral process usually is stuck somewhere. And for that reason, we'll see a multiplication. So there'll be some empty gestures, some not very meaningful efforts, but I don't think we need to worry about it too much. That's the natural way to go. Your challenge on 2 outcomes. I mean, first of all, the target is to agree the loss and damage fund, the rules. There's a transition committee, we heard. That's a steep ask, I would imagine, to agree some of these rules in 1 year. So that would be my most hopeful outcome, that there is an actual agreement rather than another agreement to negotiate the modalities. That's one. The second big ask is, of course, we need to hit great ambition soon. It's the urgency that's missing, and so the key pledges need to be driven up. The global stocktake is that chance to drive up the level of ambition. And it's no longer about what we are doing in 2050. It's not even about what we're doing in 2030. It's what we're doing in 2025. That, to me, is the key challenge. If we get some pledges around 2025, that would be amazing.
Thank you very much. Can we go in that order? So, Fariborz.
Right, I'll keep it short this time. I would I would start with what you said. I would say when it comes to momentum in the negotiations, and that has been also mentioned by you, we see certain cycles. It's just how it goes. So after a relative breakthrough COP like we had it, for example, in Sharm el Sheikh, it's not so surprising that we have a bit sclerosis and talking about nitty-gritty stuff. So I would also hope for the next COP, because it's on the global stocktake. I think that will create momentum. Also a certain type of, you rightfully said, you know, the public and the negotiations are a bit away from each other, but it could create more public protests again. We've seen that stalling partly also after, you know, with COVID restrictions. The whole Fridays for Future movement lost a bit of its track. Somebody may correct me if I'm wrong, or has been more ignored rather in the last months. So there could be a new momentum. You want to?
There are more radical movements
That is
coming
true.
up
Yeah,
that are
yeah.
saying this is not enough.
Yeah, yeah,
Need
that is
urgency.
quite true. So that could lead to more rallying again in 2023. And then my hopes are on what is called the Ambition COP in Brazil, which is still a bit ahead in 2025. I think that's when maybe some new visions will come in. And then concretely, I mentioned that the vision I would hope for, where I guess there's an increasing coalition, and it sounded like utopia some years back, is this idea of a non-proliferation treaty that really talks about ending any sort of expansion of extraction, and then obviously slow phase out with all the trimmings that you need for such a treaty, implementation review, compliance review, and so forth. I think it's not too far away. It comes from the activist side, but there's more and more countries adhering to it, including in the European Union. So there could be something, not in the next 2 years, but maybe Brazil, you know, could be a turning point here. That's a big one, and I think that's something we should focus on, because as a keynote speaker said it in the major conference of my community, the US System Governance Conference, we cannot expect the fossil fuel industry to dismantle itself. That is simply something we've tried doing for many years. And in spite of what I said before about fossil fuel subsidy reform, just last year we saw over $50 trillion in fossil fuel subsidies. So it's a drop in the ocean what's currently happening, and the UNFCCC would be the right place to get this going. So that's a big hope. I would think we need to keep mainstreaming sustainable development and environment into other types of negotiations and treaties. Preferential trade agreements are obviously one way to do that. And ironically, sometimes environmental concerns are more integrated there, biodiversity and climate change in particular, than they are between the major secretariats. So I think this is also a route to go down. And finally, I just want to say something, because I said utopia, which is something I think is not part of these negotiations, also because it's not adhering to particular goals. But I think for me, as a researcher, is some major issue that we have ignored. If we want to have a major behavior change, if you also want to see a change in debates about responsibility in the long run, we cannot get around asking about education for sustainable development. So I'm not saying that the climate negotiations are the major forum where we can bring this up, but somehow it could be inserted. Because we are wondering, 50 years ago we had the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, we had the Club of Rome report, and we're wondering why we're moving so slowly in our societies. And none of the big transformations, none of the big societal changes we've seen, you name it, right? Emancipation, LGBT, whatever, finishing smoking, has only happened because of top-down command and control aspects, or because of incentive mechanisms. There's always a third stream, and that third stream is education and value change. Right? Otherwise, you can have the best laws in the world and they're not being implemented. Implementation is what we're struggling with. So more concerted ideas about how we educate young people in the formative years when we can reach them, so that maybe in 10, 20, 30 years we have another type of discussion, including in these negotiations, and a smaller gap between people on the street and people within the building. Where things are negotiated. I think it's the main way to go for.
Thanks a lot. Nagme?
Yeah, so one summit that I did attend was Stockholm Plus 50 before the summer, and that was a huge disappointment, but they did do a lot of footwork to bring in different voices, different ideas, and the proposals that came out of it are quite progressive. And as you said, we know what we need to do, but we just need to figure out how to do it. So the loss and damage and the adaptation focus, absolutely, we will need to deal with the consequences of climate change, and we need to help on that. But I hope you're wrong on that. The mitigation side of things will sort of shift away from the UNFCCC, because there was an agreement on the mitigation work program. I think the global stocktake, as you've been saying, could provide some kind of momentum. And the UN Secretary General will convene a new climate ambition summit next year. So with these different types of tools, I hope that countries can come together and start delivering on their promises, because, yeah, we all know what needs to be done.
Thank you. Georg, your hopes?
Well, I'll just focus on the COP and the UN process. I think it is important to, and I'm saying this not only because I've been working in this process for way too long, maybe, but I think you had Swedish contributors to this arrangements here, and Swedes. I like this. Man måste jämföra. You have to compare, with, what is the what type of issue are we looking at here, and it's a UN process, and I would actually claim that there's nothing you can compare with that's being dealt with in the UN process that is this difficult. It goes into the core national interests of so many countries, whether it's those who get impacted by climate change or those who really need to do more in order to reduce emissions. And point me to one UN process that actually has been delivering as much as this process have been doing over these 30 years. It's a norm-setting regime. It's not declarations. It's real politics. But again, it's going way too slow. But it's going through, as you said, also through various hoops as far as what is also important around the world, as far as how easy it is for countries to deal with this issue. But anyhow, I don't think it's. The process itself is not that bad, and you can't expect every COP to deliver the way we did in Glasgow, for instance, last year. There is a lot of work going on in each COP that is going under the radar as far as steadily improving the cooperation under the Convention, the Paris Agreement, which is important, not least also in the support that's needed for developing countries. Secondly, I think the COP, as you pointed to, Robert, has changed certainly since 2015, as far as being more of a focus on implementation. This COP, in fact, had was termed the implementation COP, but the implementation is not happening in the negotiation rooms. So in all of this political noise and everything coming out of a COP, one should look at what's happening in connection with each of the COPs now. And when the COPs have grown to be as big as they are as far as participation, someone told me that it was around 40,000 in Sharm el Sheikh, it is because it's attracting actors who's actually discussing real solutions, implementation, and I think that's a good sign. And it's not only NGOs, it's actually industrial actors, and it's showing the solutions, it's sharing knowledge, and making deals. So even though I'm skeptical to having these COPs the size they are, it's not because we have been enhancing the sizes of delegations. It's other actors that have come in. So positive in that. Lastly, we did agree in Sharm el Sheikh on what's called a mitigation work program, and at least I have some hope that this work program that will go over 3 years will be positive in the way that we can share knowledge, we can share experience, and look at solutions that hopefully also will help in opening up for more political ambition. At least I hope so. And finally, up to Dubai, yes, we have to deliver on the process that we agreed on, loss and damage. But I think it's important. It was important in Sharm. It's going to be just as important in the way up to Dubai, that we recognize and we message very clearly that loss and damage, adaptation and mitigation are really two sides of the same coin. And if we are not able to do more and raise the ambitions on mitigating, and I'm talking now globally, we're facing even worse consequences of climate change. And I think that realization has to be there, and maybe it will even, that also can help push politically. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I haven't opened for questions yet, but I already have 3. So please, we'll start with 3 here, and those of you who want to ask questions, please raise your hand, so I'll just put you on the list, right? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Talgat Jumagulov. I'm a Minister Consul at the Embassy of Kazakhstan in Norway. For Kazakhstan, whose goal is to become carbon neutral by 2060, the major news from COP27 was the agreement with the European Union on the establishment of huge green hydrocarbon cluster in western Kazakhstan. And the Euro Commission President and Prime Minister of Kazakhstan made a joint statement on that. And Swedish company Svevind was behind this huge project, by the way. But I want to ask something else. There were news stories in recent days about a major breakthrough in fusion power announced in the US. What is your take as climate and energy experts on that? Have you already analyzed this, and do you share the optimism that this can be a kind of game changer in global energy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have 5 questions, so can we gather them?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for an excellent keynote and a great panel debate. So, and I'm Karin Bäckström from Stockholm University. I have a question actually to the whole of panel, looking into the future, namely the debate on the reform of COP. We can say that form follows function, and if it is that COP has changed along the lines you suggested, Robert, with a different function of moving away from mitigation, being this business fair, shouldn't COP change? And this has been a long debate. Should COPs be this traveling circus, or should they be more sharp and lean in Bonn, mainly a forum for states? And I think this is a kind of critical question for legitimacy too, because now COPs are this, as was suggested, this forum for a democratic dialogue between civil society, governments, and industry, a lot of non-state actors with access, this deliberation, and it's also spilled over to that going to a COP, it's about indigenous people rights, LGBTQ, youth, women rights, moving away from the core, some would argue, function of mitigation. So do we need, I mean, the reform of megalateral summitry has been discussed, but do we actually, as the implementation is taking on national level with climate laws, climate legislation, climate litigation, the states will take the lead in overcoming carbon lock-in, not the COPs. Will we need another COP for the future, a more lean COP?
Thank you. Elin Leon-Boasson from the University of Oslo. So I just wanted to ask you, because you've all been quite pessimistic, and that's very easy to get pessimistic when we talk about these things. But really, after 2015, we've had a very, very radical transformation in how we perceive the climate challenge. Because we used to think that it was about stabilizing emissions or reducing them a little bit, but now we all talk about net zero. And it's just a total radical new way of approaching this issue. And we have 90% of the countries of the world have now pledges and ambitions to reach net zero, which was unthinkable 20 years ago. So I just want your comments on the role of the negotiations in creating this amazing and radical new way of approaching the whole issue.
My name is Todung Mulya Lubis. I'm Indonesian ambassador here in Oslo. I come from Indonesia, and we in Indonesia and other developing countries as well talk a lot about climate fund. John Kerry has come up with an idea that what seems to be shifting the financial burden from the states to the corporations. Robert, I just would like to have your take on this, because we just finished our G20 meeting in Bali, where another pledge was made for Indonesia to help Indonesia in green transition. 20 billion US dollars. I think that would be probably kind of state and private partnership. State would provide some funds, and then companies also, private companies also would chip in into that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening conversation so far. Sven Egenter from the Clean Energy Wire, a Berlin-based media service on Europe's energy transition. Given the picture you've painted, and actually also what you said just now about where the priorities are and where the real stumbling block is, the one side of the coin, mitigation and ambition, and the whole scene you set and the picture you painted about who's now involved and where, I do now struggle really understanding why the loss and damage fund is such a diplomatic priority on many levels, because there have been all these failed attempts to raise enough money. And it sounds to me now a little bit like, oh, okay, so we failed on 3 attempts, now we add a 4th. And invest a lot of diplomatic and political capital and a lot of headline grabbing, which frankly, as a journalist, maybe it's just me, could have been put someplace else. And I just would like to get your take on that, whether this is a case of maybe we should just drop that, because I don't see the diplomatic rationale behind it at this point.
Thank you for the questions. Can you volunteer? I mean, there's 4 of you, there's 5 questions, so 1.25 question per person.
I can't say much about fusion, so I'll bail out.
Okay, maybe just a couple of things. The fusion technology I don't know enough about, but of course any type of technology breakthrough is positive. I do think though that really the challenge just now is not about the technology and solutions. I mean, we know what the solutions are. It's more about the political will and what's necessary in order to actually implement and get this through. I mean, that's. But it's if this breakthrough that has been mentioned on fusion power is it sounds great. I can't really say more about that. Reform of the COP, yes, and this is a discussion that's been ongoing internally among parties in the COP also, and I can put forward my own view, which I don't think I should do, but I wouldn't really traveling circus. It's not something a term I would use, but and there are some advantages with having the COP shift between the five UN regions, which is the case now. It's also about ownership and commitment, and we could place, of course, all of the COPs in Bonn, which we think makes sense economically, and otherwise I don't think it's politically possible. But yes, again, it's an ongoing debate how to make it more lean and more effective, and I think that discussion has to be taken, certainly. To Elin, yes, it's partly what I was trying to say. I'm a bit more optimistic about what the UN process is actually delivering, and I also don't think it would have been possible to get those type of long-term commitments, even also short-term commitments, without a UN process that actually also is delivering on some fronts. And that's I'm still optimistic about the necessity of the UN process. Can I just also briefly just say that, of course, we know that there are 20 people are talking about G20 as a group of countries that emit around 80 plus something of the global emissions today. If they could agree, then everything would be solved. Norway is not part of the G20. We were invited in the G20 process after Paris when Germany had the chairmanship of the G20. And I participated in the discussions on climate, which was mostly focused on implementation of the Paris Agreement, and the Germans were that had a high priority for the Germans. And I can only say that I was very, very disappointed about getting inside this process and see what's actually going on there compared to what we're doing in the UN. So I think it has the legitimacy has to be there, and it's about bringing this forward as an issue globally, where parties have, or countries have, various type of concerns and interests, and you need to have that type of legitimacy. Finally, just on financing, I'm not sure it's it's always been the case, even from the beginning, when climate finance really came up as a real issue. In around 2009, and the discussions there, which ended in this commitment on 100 billion. Mobilizing has always been an issue here, and what can governments do, not only in delivering funding over budgets, but also how governments can incentivize and mobilize private sector financing. And it's a challenge, but it has to be part of the solution. I can't see how you can face those enormous challenges that we have without that type of mobilization. And that's why I think also the 2.1c in the Paris Agreement is crucial. You have to shift the large flows of finance if you're going to deal with this. And the question of commitments among parties will still be important. But I think both for the loss and damage in the future, those challenges that we have there, but also on a new finance goal, for instance, in the Paris Agreement, if we can't get a broader financial base than we have today, which is basically the old small OECD club of countries, if you can't see that, if you can't get a political understanding that on the 30 years since we agreed on the climate convention, the world has changed. And for many countries, very much changed economically, and also when it comes to emissions. And that's a big political issue that's going to be even more important to solve, I think, when we're getting into discussions on new targets, and also how we're going to finance not only loss and damage, but also adaptation for the most vulnerable. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for excellent questions. On fusion, I am not an expert, but just from the analysis I've read, says that for the short time we have to decarbonize, fusion is not the solution. So it could come into effect maybe after the world has decarbonized. But also there are fears that if this happens and there's unlimited and free energy, basically, then the resource depletion problematic will keep being a risk. So even if you solve that, if it helps climate, it might not help biological diversity. So I wouldn't see it as like this big solution. On the private finance, I was a bit surprised by John Kerry's proposal there to have more carbon credits, basically, to finance climate mitigation and maybe then adaptation. And I think that their carbon market integrity is key, and we know that that has stalled. It's a difficult political question. And I think if we get carbon market rules that are untransparent, allow for double counting, doesn't deal with this additionality question, then we haven't learned anything from the CDM, because I think there are many lessons there that we need to heed. And then finally, Elin's question on net zero goals. I would agree with you that the UNFCCC has been successful in the, sort of the norm setting, in getting countries to learn from each other and inspire each other on setting these targets. But another part of our project is to study countries' long-term strategies. So there are about 50 countries that have submitted these strategies to the UNFCCC. And of course, they vary a lot in detail and in strength, but very few of them actually do what the latest IPCC report said, which was that we can't have incremental change anymore. We need sort of systematic transformation of different systems. So I think another interesting debate at the COPs in the future will be, how long can we keep the 1.5 degree target alive, and what happens when it's dead? Because from the plans that we've seen so far, we're not just lacking ambition, but we're also lacking on the implementation of the plans. So there's still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not an expert on fusion either. I can only support what's been said. I think we need a proper risk assessment. We also need a benefit assessment. I think that sounds promising currently what we have in fusion. I'm doing the typical thing an academic does. If you don't know what to answer, you just answer what you know, but not the question. So what I do know is that other technologies have been gravely overestimated. Think of the whole BECCS debate. There's probably drop in the ocean. Whatever there, I know figures like we hope at one point to get to remove 2 megatons per year CO2 equivalent, while we're talking about needing to get rid of 3.3 gigatons. So, and it's amazing how much talk in town is about just that. Then think about the whole climate engineering debate and all the side effects. So we have a long way to go. If it works, I'm all for it. But we know from the past that there have been all sorts of destructive aspects and a lack of risk assessment. And we need to keep our eyes focused on the main aspects, as Nagne said. Funding, I would again come back to something I said before. I mean, we are, and you get this from the whole panel, what we are lacking is implementation compliance on the groundwork. That is what we have to work at. We can have the best goals in the world, we can have the best funds in the world. There are 2 types of ways to try to change behavior, and they're the kind of top-down or market-based ways. Right? The third one is education, my little utopia, but I think that's really where we get to awareness. What we see time and again, either with funding mechanisms directly or also with incentive mechanisms, is that they are only as good as the environment in which they are placed. Of course, they're also only as good as the whole rule book that's around them, no doubt about that. But ultimately, the idea that a one-size-fits-all type of overarching carbon credit is the way forward has always, it never has been sitting totally well with me. It's one tool, but it's not the whole answer. Right? And then the last 3 questions, Ellen's point about what's positive about the COPs, no doubt about that, and then also the COP reform question and your question about goals, they all go in the same direction. Again, I think what I would keep the COPs as they are currently, traveling circus or not, because they deliver on certain aspects, and they are a success story. If you really look at the policy cycle when it comes to agenda setting, probably information sharing and raising awareness, right? Not necessarily creating awareness, but raising awareness in a certain way. That's what they've been good for, and that's maybe why we should keep them having. If you look at the circus, yes, you have increasing chaos, you have profiteering. If you think about Sharm el Sheikh, that has been a major reproach. Chaos, Copenhagen, if it's in mind. But it also creates a lot of publicity, which is not to be underestimated every year. And it's something we need to create awareness change in the long run. So I think I would be for keeping them, and they've given us a momentum when it comes to goals. Why do we have the loss and damage fund now? I can only repeat myself. I think we are in a bit of a loop where we keep in international negotiations, biodiversity framework, Sustainable Development Goals, Paris Agreement, where we now keep producing goals, first of all, then we keep adopting funds, then we start wondering about the rule book and how we should get things done, and that's where we get stuck. So this is the first step that's always relatively easy to get to. And I don't mean that in a cynical way. I think that's A, why it happens, and B, it's been a high time on loss and damage. So I still rather take the agreement than just being stuck in the other three things. Now I'm rather stuck in 4, because at least we have something to build on. But we will not move to the extent that we need it if we don't get this whole implementation on the ground question sorted. Now, sorry to go over time, but one thing, I mentioned this whole utopia that we should maybe tie certain types of tools to questions about education, right? But there's one thing we should keep wondering about. Another utopia is the UNFCCC doesn't have any capacities on the ground. If you compare it with the UNDP, for example, the UN Development Program is the face of the United Nations in 170 plus countries. The UNFCCC doesn't have that capacity on the ground, even though implementation assistance is one of its mandates. So if we should do something, think a bit big, visionarily about reform, then I think there is a chance, maybe, to change the type of phase of the UN climate regime, not in 5 years, 10 years, but maybe in 20, 30 years. More capacities on the ground, more regional offices to maybe help move things a bit more in terms of implementation.
A couple of quick responses. I'd be wary of anyone who promises free energy and cheap energy. I think that was once tried with nuclear energy. When nuclear came along, it was going to be so cheap that we would have an abundance of energy. Nuclear is still 50, 60, 70 years after it was invented, currently the most expensive form of energy in most countries. So I'd be a bit careful about the promises that those that are seeking funding for their technology are making about that. John Kerry arguing for the private sector to provide a lot of the funding. Any American world leader will forever ask the private sector to do what the government is unable to deliver. America basically has a broken domestic political system, and for that reason they look to the private sector to deliver on that front. I'm not surprised that this is the line they're taking. Kerry is also on the record of saying it is technology that will fix climate in the long run. I take you back to the first answer I gave on that one. And finally, let me make just one more point. I'm a bit frustrated with people who look at the circus, the annual circus in November and December, who complain about all the air miles we rack up. Not me, but other people. So on the one hand, we're told this is the world's most pressing, most complex, most urgent issue to resolve. And on the other hand, we don't want all the people who can make a difference to come together once a year to try and work on that. There's a huge intellectual gap between these two statements. And I just don't get that. This completely underestimates the scale of the problem. If we didn't have the COP, we'd need to invent a different kind of global gathering of that kind, where politics and business, where civil society and diplomats come together. I would describe the COP, I mean, if anything, perhaps it needs a bit of a media facelift. Sven, I'm looking at you now. This should be called the World Climate Parliament, where once in a year the world comes together and debates, not takes grand decisions, but debates how we progress. And some ideas like net zero take off and they then become the norm. And that's very important. So you can have a parallel process in Bonn, perhaps just the negotiators. That's fine, but don't give up on the one and only gathering that exists. If we didn't have that, remember the world is disintegrating. We're facing now a future international order that's best described as deep pluralism, where regions and powers drift apart, where China creates its own international finance institutions, where the European Union creates its own climate club. We are disintegrating, and we need to retain those spaces that bring us all together. Vitally important.
Thank you very much. May I ask you to give a big hand to our panelists? And well, there's coffee in the lobby, so if you want to continue the discussions, there's an opportunity to do that there. I'm sorry that the Q&A was probably shorter than we would have wished, but that's how it is. Thank you very much.